this is actually our most ambitious and largest exhibition since the opening of the museum here at Kendall Square. So it's the largest changeover of an exhibition since we opened here about 2.5 years ago. So we're very excited to host it. And it's also an exhibition that has evolved since its Swiss birth. We heard about the birth, but it's a growing organism. So some of you may have experienced the dream installation next door, which allows your dreams to be impacted as you sleep or nap, and something that I'm personally looking forward very much to trying out. So it's an evolving exhibition. Lighten up. It seems like a strange thing to say right now to somebody, like, lighten up, cheer up. So we did discuss this a lot in our team. Is this a little bit like, the final scene of The Life of Brian, where they say, always look on the bright side of life, or the Joker, why is so serious? But actually, I don't know if this exhibition will cheer you up, but I do think that and hope that it will stimulate you to thinking in new ways about circadian rhythms and about the way daylight affects our bodies. This is an area where there's been, as Paula mentioned, tremendous research in the last few years, and also a Nobel Prize in 2017 for researchers, including one not too far from MIT at Brandeis, for research on the genes that determine circadian rhythms. So it's a hot topic, and I'm really thrilled that we have a panel who will discuss it with us, who are connected with this exhibition in different ways, and who are also coming from different perspectives, from science, from art, and also from architecture. So I'd like to just say a little bit about our panelists before I invite them to join us on the stage. So we have Marilyne Andersen, who you heard about already. So Professor Marilyne Andersen. Marilyne is the head of the Laboratory of Integrated Performance in Design at the EPFL. She's also the Director General of a newish organization called GESDA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, which I've been hearing about, and it seems like a really interesting organization. And the whole idea of being an anticipator of science and diplomacy sounds very exciting. Marilyne was one of the curators of the original exhibition in the EPFL Pavilions that we heard about, but she's also no stranger to MIT. She was actually an associate professor here in the Building Technology Group of the MIT School of Architecture and Planning, and also the head of the MIT Daylighting Lab that she founded back in 2004. So Marilyne, would you like to come up to the stage, please? Thank you. And our second panelist is an artist who focuses on the real and speculative behavior of light. His name is Alan Bogana. He's from Switzerland and came over just a few days ago to Boston. And he is going to be exploring with us how the arts can contribute to our understanding and experience of circadian rhythms. Alan, please join us. Thank you. And finally, someone who's closer to home, Beth Klerman is the professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, also research investigator at Mass General within the Department of Neurology, and a physician within the Division of Sleep Medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And she's bringing the perspective of a scientific expert on circadian rhythms to the panel. So please join us, Beth. So I'm going to take a leap of faith and assume that my microphone is still working. Great. So, there we go. Great. So maybe to start with you, Marilyne, as one of the instigators of this whole project, Lighten Up. It might be interesting maybe to hear a little bit about, first of all, what do you see as the core idea in the exhibition, and also, maybe you can expand in terms of how your own work in relation to lighting and building and design affected your approach to the exhibition.
Great, thank you very much, Michael John. Yes, it's amazing to be back here, so to speak, and see the MIT family in this beautiful location at the interface between art and science. So indeed, Lighten Up on Biology and Time kind of encapsulates what it's about in its own title. It is about light as a giver of time to the living, to biology on Earth, related to the day-night cycle that we all evolved in, that is, of course, related to the rotation of the Earth around the Sun, and therefore as to how important it is to stay connected, exposed to, and get an intake of light to synchronize our biological rhythms and be in tune with the environment we live in and have evolved in. And as we all know, us humans have a tendency to alter these equilibria from time to time and to live in cities or indoors rather than outdoors, to put our physiology, to challenge our physiology by living in conditions that might not be exactly those under which we evolved, and therefore have implications on how we feel, how we sleep, what our immune system is, how our alertness evolves when we are alert, and so on. So how this came to be as in my own interest, so I'm a physicist by training, but I've always had this sort of hesitation between science, pure science, or art to some extent. So at the end of my journey in physics, I wanted to see things again, not just work on equations. And after my PhD, when I became a professor at MIT, this was the moment where I actually had the chance to start working with the Harvard Medical School, Steve Lockley amongst others, and it opened my eyes to the field of neuroscience and so other aspects of light that could relate to architecture as the context in which they apply to human beings. When I went back to EPFL is where I really started or continued to work on the psychophysiological effects of light on human in general. And then through different encounters, this is always how things happen in life. Luck, you meet someone, you have an opportunity, you seize it. So this is what happened also in this case, to be brought into this world of art that had always fascinated me, even though as a physicist I was maybe a more remote, but the architecture field brought me one step closer, and then this opportunity to start to engage in a different way of communicating science, not through lectures, not through explanations, not through papers or books, but through the emotional pathway, through a personal engagement with people on a scientific subject from your own willingness. What you give and what you take is your own doing. So this exhibition is meant to offer you an opportunity to engage with this scientific theme of circadian rhythms, chronobiology, photobiology, so the effect of light on physiology through the brain, and so for humans through the brain, but it affects all living beings on Earth, and to look at this from what you want to learn from it. What struck me most when we had the first exhibition in Lausanne was how people came to me more, I think, it's a bit frustrating, but more, I think, than when I gave a lecture to tell me, so light is really important. Yes, it is. So it is, and make sure to get immersed and sort of feel how much it is through these very different forms, very different dimensions.
And it is a very experiential exhibition, and you also, maybe we can talk later, you have a really interesting work yourself as part of the exhibition, which allows you to go through this dark curtain and find yourself in a city and experience some of the disturbances of your circadian rhythms while you're in a city. But I think this focus on allowing people to experience circadian rhythms is really fascinating. But I would like to turn to Beth, though, as a scientific expert on sleep, on circadian rhythms. There's a kind of a nice introductory phrase to the exhibition, which says the rotation of the planet is ingrained in our very being, with the ever-present cycle of night and day providing a blueprint for the evolution of all living organisms. Circadian rhythms, from the Latin circa diem, meaning around a day, are driven by our internal clock, many aspects of our health and behavior are therefore grounded in and coordinated by the endless transitions between light and dark. So as a scientist, this intertwining of light and the experience of time and the effects on the body, how can you explain that from a scientific perspective?
Well, that's like a career to explain it from a scientific perspective. I want to pull apart a little bit about what you're talking about and as I try to answer your question, which is I'm interested in circadian rhythms, which are the daily rhythms, but I also want to mention that seasonal rhythms are also affected by light, as are lunar rhythms. So there are multiple frequencies of rhythms, of biological rhythms, of which circadian rhythms are ones that most people are aware of. I just want to point out that humans still have seasonal rhythms. We are not immune to those. Mm-hmm. The interest that I have is that the circadian clock is this internal clock that enables humans and other creatures to predict linear time. How long before something will happen. And if I have a clock that says, oh, there's approximately a 24-hour day, now might be the time for me to prepare because it's going to get dark soon. Or now to prepare to, if I'm a date-active animal, now might be the time to start preparing to go somewhere where I can sleep quietly. So using the circadian clock to predict time to make physiology more important, whether it's, as you said, making a medication more important, or perhaps having less of a side effect of a medication. Mm-hmm. And so from my perspective, the interest in biology is both this combination of linear time and circular time, and then how the internal clock uses that to interact with the external environment, whether it's now I'm going to eat or now I'm going to do something else. And light is how the internal clock knows what external time is. So that is my interest, and I pulled a little part of what you said and hopefully just put it back together again at the end.
Yeah, but just to follow up on so Paula mentioned this recent research here at MIT on liver metabolism and the fact that it is different at different hours of the day, and that can affect when one chooses to administer drugs and so on, and medication. So those kinds of phenomena, to what extent would you say that they are fairly much shared across populations, or are they highly variable between individuals? The question, whether it's the liver metabolism or also the seasonal effects that you were talking about. I mean, are these areas where we'd have to have a really personalized approach to medication, or do you think that one can make sort of broad assumptions about, times of day and seasons where people's bodies behave in particular ways?
So, yes and no. I mean, we'd like to think that humans in some ways are very similar. However, even in terms of your biological clock, there are some people who are morning people and there are some people who are evening people. Mm-hmm. And so you might not necessarily want to give the particular medication at noon, because to an adolescent, that's really early in the morning, and to an older person, that might be midday. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues about circadian medicine right now is how much do we actually need to know what somebody's internal time is to say this is the time to take a medication or to have some other intervention or to go to sleep or something like that. This is an active area investigation, and we come up against actual scheduling events, like you schedule somebody to morning or afternoon therapy, or you just hope that they take their medication, let alone they take it at 3 hours after they wake up. And that's part of implementation science, which is an increasingly important area of medicine where lots of scientists do basic science. I keep on looking at Paula because she got first. Do basic science, and then I do more translational science. And then there's a new area where how do we actually take what we've learned from science and actually improve people's lives. Mm-hmm. So that's, and what you just asked is an actual great area that's actively investigated for implementation science.
And maybe to move on to Alan. So you have a work in this exhibition, and it's an artwork that is somewhat speculative, I understand, that in terms of how one might imagine the earliest systems of vision in proto-organisms. Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing in this artwork? I don't know, who's seen the artwork of Alan in the exhibit? Yeah, so many people have encountered it. It's, what's going on there?
So the project was born during an art and science residency at EPFL.
Yes.
In Lausanne, Switzerland, as mentioned. And where I spent 4 months working closely with researchers in photonics, specifically in the optics and applied photonic devices lab. They were developing experimental techniques to 3D print objects and biocompatible scaffoldings directly with light. And the more time I spent in the lab, the more I became fascinated with the idea of casting light itself and not using light to illuminate or represent something, but rather treating it as a material that could be shaped, fossilized, and ultimately give form to its own trajectories. And over the course of this residency, I created a collection of more than 60 translucent objects, a kind of open taxonomy of light solidified shapes, all born from the interactions between light and matter.
And so these were sculpted with lasers? Or?
Yes. Basically, I started just shooting like a straight light beam through this resin to see what it comes out. Mm-hmm. Also, the researchers that were with me were like, that's kind of not interesting to do, but actually the results were more interesting. And then I complexified the process and setup the more I was advancing. And many of these objects somehow seem more, I was proceeding into the project, more they seem sort of ambiguously reminiscent of primitive organisms, organs of visions, and fossils, as if they've belonged to an alternative evolutionary record shaped by photons instead of DNA somehow. And I began to imagine these objects as speculative fossils of vision, material traces of processes that normally unfold invisibly or at vastly different scales of time. So historically, what is made difficult also to understand the evolution of the eye is precisely the absence of fossils since soft tissues rarely fossilize. Mm-hmm. And speculatively, the project became a meditation on how billions of years of photic evolution from the first light-sensitive cells to complex organs of sight be condensed into a few seconds of laser exposure. Mm-hmm. So through this process, the work evolved into an exploration of how light perception and temporality intertwine, how light, as usually associated with speed and immateriality, can be slowed down, embodied, and made tangible. And this connects directly with the theme of Lighten Up.
And light and time connecting, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, as art and biology are deeply entangled with time, and from circadian rhythms and evolutionary adaptation to the fleeting lifespan of a photon. And the work tries to capture those ephemeral, invisible transformation, translate them into lasting physical traces.
And so I know we have a lot of visitors from Switzerland tonight. Is anyone in the room suffering from jet lag today? Anyone? Okay, you, I know. So what happens when it goes wrong? So when our internal clocks fall out of sync with the day and night cycle, which I guess jet lag is one example. Can you?
You want to talk about how you feel right now? Space, I would say. Reading the descriptions of the arts, I could not really process it to be well. Yeah, and I really enjoyed the...
That might not be jet lag. Just kidding.
So, there are actually 3 clocks that are relevant to how you feel. There are actually 3 clocks that are relevant to how you feel. There's your internal circadian clock that we're talking about. There's the sun clock, which is what, as we've mentioned, is how your internal clock knows the outside time of day. And there's the clock on your wrist or your computer or whatever. And what's just happened is that your internal clock is not yet adjusted to the solar clock or the local clock time here. And so your internal clock, which, as I've said, helps us predict what should happen at a particular time, thinks you should be asleep if you just came from Europe. And it doesn't think you should be eating, and it thinks that you should be doing all sorts of other things. So that's for jet lag.
Yeah.
People who have to work night shifts, the same thing happens to them. They're trying to work at a time at which their internal clock does not think they should work, and they're trying to sleep at a time when their internal clock thinks that they should be, they're trying to sleep, should be awake. Mm-hmm. And the issue is if you do night shift work, you come home during the day, and so you're still getting that morning stimulus as you drive home from the night shift where your body clock says, oh, it's morning, rather than I've tried to shift to night work. There's some evidence that some people who are morning evening type versus evening type versus morning type may adapt better to shift work. There's very little evidence that most people can adapt. Mm-hmm. So that's an example in which your internal body clock is at odds with the external light cycle as well as their external local time.
Mm-hmm. And does it help if you keep your watch on the other time? No.
So actually, I did my postdoc with blind people because people who are totally blind know the time of day, mm-hmm. and they know everything else except they're just not getting light input to tell their circadian clock what time of day it is. Mm-hmm. And it turns out knowing what time of day was not enough for blind people. They mm-hmm. needed to have the light input. Now, the other really interesting thing that came out of that was we showed in humans, before it was showed in animals, that there's actually two different photoreceptors. Well, there's more than one. There's multiple photoreceptors in your eyes. So that the photoreceptors in your eyes that detect light for circadian rhythms and for alertness and for heart rate and for your pupillary response are different than used for conscious vision, for your looking at you or you're seeing the stairs. And we found some blind people who are blind by all standard criteria, but were not circadian blind. We found this before it was found in animals, because then people could do animal experiments where they could do genetic mutations, knock out conscious visions, rods and cones, the equivalent of rods and cones in humans, and show that there was this different photoreceptor system. And so blind people were what taught us that knowing the time of day is not enough, and also helped reveal that there was this different photoreceptive system in the eye.
Mm-hmm. And so, yes. Wonderful. We saw from the poll earlier that our audience, most of you are more creative in the evening, which is wonderful. And we will have a chance to express that creativity. We have questions, an opportunity for questions from the audience. There is the QR code. It's actually the same one from the poll. If you just submit your questions there, I believe you can also upvote other people's questions if you think they're particularly exciting. And then Keelan will help us to share the questions from the audience. So please do use your creativity to come up with the questions. Marilyne, so working as an architect, how can one rethink buildings to be more in tune with our circadian rhythms, or to help us live in tune with our circadian rhythms?
Yes, thank you. So I just want to say I work with architects. I cannot pretend I am an architect, although I love to be taken as an architect by architects or as a physicist by scientists. The other way around, I have more issues. But yeah, so there is a lot to do. Of course, the most obvious thing would be to live outdoors in the environment in which we evolved. That would be perfect recipe for having well-synchronized biological rhythms, have dark nights, bright days, like we should. Architecture and buildings create an artificially dim inside environment that is more or less 100 times darker than the outside. We don't feel it is so dark because our brain is super good at adjusting the interval of light levels that we are sensitive to the environment we are in. The moon looks pale during the day, looks bright during the night. It's exactly the same luminance, it's exactly the same brightness, but our brain has been adjusted to a different level, and therefore it appears brighter. So this happens also in our misconception that indoors is pretty much as bright as the outdoors. No, even under overcast skies, it is 100 times more or less brighter outdoors. So we have dim days, bright-ish, too bright evenings, and even nights with light pollution. So that means architecture should try to mitigate rather than worsen this lack of, or this diminishing contrast between day and night under which we evolved and that we really need physiologically. So what does this mean? Well, maybe to be provocative, it could mean two things. Design wonderful buildings that are so well daylit that we experience a bright environment even indoors. We are close to windows, beautiful atria, or design such poor buildings that we spend more time outdoors to escape from the indoors and still get the dose of light that we need during the day to get the contrast between day and night. This is provocative. Of course, we want to aim for the good buildings. Ideally, I would say that this design should be naturally conducive to behave in a way that is good for you, that you want to spend time in the areas where you could have this increased dose of light. We actually have developed a startup company based on the research that we conducted to help designers, architects, building owners to think about mostly public buildings, buildings in which you spend a lot of time during the day, in a way that it would be conducive to giving you that exposure to daylight that you need, knowing that the best is still outdoors. This is on the architecture side. Of course, on the urban side is the same thing. Green spaces, open spaces, street width, height of buildings, all of these matter in filtering our access to light, and is also one of the points of the installation you mentioned before, Circadium, that is meant to sort of bring us more aware of the disconnect that the urban fabric brings to being connected to the natural day-night cycles.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes, please.
Which is also, and I've heard you say this before, the importance of darkness at night. So if you want to talk more about that, because I've heard you talk.
Yeah, so I mean, you would talk about it much better than I do. But yes, so the contrast between the two is what matters, and the darkness of the night is actually almost more important than the brightness of the day to avoid the blue in the evening, to let the melatonin kick in, to let the sort of the night, biological night get started, and therefore to not stimulate the photoreceptor that Beth was mentioning before, this melanopsin, other photoreceptor not responsible for vision, but responsible for light detection, do its job of telling the body, this is the night, now it's time to do some other things like producing melatonin.
And I'm sorry, I meant like urban environments also make it harder to have dark at night if the streetlights are already always on or something. That's what
And just to follow on that, the question of color. So you mentioned blue. Talk more about the importance of color. We have an installation there. There's a bed that people can lie on where one experiences different colors while resting. What is what does it matter if one has red in the morning and blue in the evening, or vice versa? Can you talk about that? Maybe you first from the building point of view, and then from this.
So yes, it
medical
matters a lot.
Yeah.
But what matters more is the contents of the light rather than the color it looks like. So white light has a lot of blue, and that is what matters. It has to contain blue, but it does not need to be blue. And this is a big difference we should make. So what matters is that the photons that we receive and that are stimulating our sensors, the photoreceptor that we were mentioning is one of them, that it is stimulated at the right time with the right wavelengths, the right frequency or light energy. And this is what matters. So it's not so much about color, but more about contents, light contents. And indeed, evening light it's especially important that evening light, so light in the streets, for example, would not contain, or as little as possible, of the blue, because the blue is more stimulating to that photoreceptor we have been mentioning before. So we should move away from stimulating it too much in the evening. Light pollution in general is bad. Blue enriched light is even worse. Whereas in the morning, and when you get to an optician and need to buy new glasses, be wary of listening to the filtering out of the blue. Blue is very important. The blue content is very important during the day, the morning in particular. So don't think that blue is bad. It is depending on when you're exposed to it.
And I'm curious, do you have anything to add to that in terms of, no, okay.
No, I mean, that's what biological time is. The same thing I find so interesting, the same thing that you do at one time of day may be considered good, at another time of day may be considered bad, and one time of day may have more effect, another time of day may have another side effect, and so I get to learn all these about all these interesting fields, and I just say, have you thought about the time at which you're probing the system, or you're learning something? So,
yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I have something.
Yes, Alan, please.
As you've been talking about the outdoor or the urban environment, but I think it's also about like a cultural somehow habits, or like tonight we're here, outdoor is night, and if these lights were having a filter, would it be better for our life hygiene or not?
So going back to, it depends for whom. If this was a hospital, which light should we have? For the patients, it should be not blue, so dim, dark, or red, if anything, to heal, to have a good night, to have a dark night. But for the people healing them, they should be alert. And especially if they are night shifters, artificially we would push them to be more vigilant, more alert, so that they can make a good job of healing the others. So even for a given environment, at a given moment of time, two populations with different needs will need different, ideally need different lights, and then it's...
Could you wear like polarized glasses or something like that to... so you each get the light that you need? Or?
I mean, physically the polarization wouldn't help much, but yes, there are some tries to attempts to have glasses that would emit some light in your eye, have been attempted, more on the blue or less. These are all kind of pilot projects, I would say. But the coexistence of populations with conflicting needs in a given built or living environment, there is an almost impossible equation to solve. And then maybe one solution indeed is to become personalized light exposure to the point where you are in your own light bubble that is serving your needs right then, which doesn't mean that they are good for jet lag. So here to be in a very bright environment makes us still alert. But if we were to get ready for sleep, which is maybe a bit early, then we should dim it down and make them more red to help us a little bit. Yeah.
And Beth, just to come back to you, what are the big kind of unsolved problems? I mean, you mentioned earlier about this question of personalized kind of metabolism or circadian rhythms, but what are the big challenging questions out there that researchers are trying to solve in relation to circadian rhythms right now?
So from my perspective, because I'm interested in human medicine, circadian and other medicine, I'm not as interested, in molecular biology. Exactly what you just said. How can I tell what times an individual's time of day is? Internally, so that I can possibly time it. That we know there are morning types, we know there are evening types. How can I figure out whether somebody is a morning and an evening type so that I can eventually time an intervention or say this is when you should do something else? And that, for me, is the most exciting part of the biggest unsolved problem right now. If you were a molecular biologist, I think you'd say something else.
And Alan, as an artist, do you find that your creative work is best at particular times of the day, or do you build that into your creative process?
I mean, you mean when I'm most creative?
Yes.
I would say rather morning with some sparks of genius or delusion in late afternoon, I would say. Sometimes. That's my time.
Interesting. So you get a kind of quick flash in the late afternoon. And
Afternoon is kind of going down, and then last moments of activity. Evening.
Fantastic. So there's so much more to discuss, but I would like to give the audience a chance to ask questions. And so, Keelan, are there any questions that have appeared on the Slido?
There are 23 questions. So
amazing.
Congrats to the audience for being a great question and upvoters. So I think we only have time for a couple, but I'm going to start with the most upvoted question, which is, what have we learned about circadian rhythms from astronauts and cosmonauts on the International Space Station?
Super interesting question. Who would like to hazard a
Maybe Beth or
response?
You can start, please.
Well, what we have learned, I mean, this is indeed a situation where you are inherently disconnected from the natural day-night cycle, and what they have learned is how important or how essential to keep that connection to a natural day-night cycle was. You cannot be functional for very long in the absence of light cues. One, because you become what we call a free runner, so your own biological rhythm doesn't have the time cue of light. Mostly the productivity might be affected and so on. So there are several ways to try to compensate for that with artificial light, to recreate an environment that would be bright during the day and dark during the night, playing with color, or playing, I would say, with spectrum more than with color. So with the contents of the light that doesn't need, again, to be colored, to look colored. Try to compensate for the lack of light intake at given moments, knowing that you always have and this is back to architecture, this conflict between having enough brightness to trigger your body to know it's the day, and of course avoiding glare or avoiding excessive use of lighting if it's unnecessary. So there is this equilibrium to find between comfort and physiological needs.
So I agree with that, and I just want to add that it also, because there are circadian rhythms still in humans and other animals, we know it's not just because of what happens on Earth. So it's not the Earth's magnetic fields or something else on the Earth, because they also exist in space. And the issue, as she said, about everybody has their own internal circadian rhythm, and it's not exactly 24 hours. And one of the problems would be if you don't entrain the entire team, people might drift apart. And so they're no longer on the same 24-hour rhythm over a months-long time up in orbit. Some people might have drifted to be on one time zone and another on another time zone. You're still trying to function as a team. And while in some ways you want some people to be early versus late, what I usually said was when your kids had sleepovers, you wanted one parent could stay awake until the last kid fell asleep and another parent was awake before the first ones woke up. Or if you have to defend a city, you want people around all the time. But if you're trying to operate as a team on the space station, you don't necessarily want that. So it was once again showing that it's not just based on something unknown cues on Earth, because it was also seen in space, and the importance of light in synchronizing the astronauts so that they could be alert during the day and asleep at night. And some of that also was related to the commander, about whether the commander made people keep a schedule of light and dark.
I think it was Till Runneberg who's actually in the audience here who said something to me one time about not trying to wake teenagers too early in the mornings. Is there something to that people's activity changes through your development, through your life? Is that correct, that you shouldn't wake up the sleeping teenagers?
Well, those are two questions. One is, do you change over your lifetime? And another is, should you wake up teenagers?
Well, it's kind of connected, right? It's like...
You want to say anything?
Till, should you wake the teenagers?
Would I wake teenagers? I wouldn't wake them because it's a waste of time. we asked them to go to school way before they could take advantage of. We asked them to come to school way before they can take advantage of sleeping, which is consolidating what they had learned the day before. And then they sit in school and have one micro-sleep after the other, and I realized very late in my life that one of the reasons why I sometimes couldn't answer a question was because I hadn't heard it. And so it's very, very inefficient to wake up teenagers because clocks get later and later and later until about the age of 20. And then they turn around again and become earlier again until we die. And in Germany, we have this wonderful word called the senile bed flight. So you get very early when you're senile and wake up early. But that probably has something to do with the fact that the circadian clock gets weaker when you're old, and that your tiredness takes over, because in young people you can tell them, even if they're tired, to fall asleep, but the circadian clock says, no, we're not going to fall asleep now. But in elderly people, the homeostat, so the measurement that measures how long you've been awake, says, I want to sleep now, and the clock may whisper, I don't want to do that now, but it doesn't have a chance against the homeostat when they're old.
Thank you.
I'm conscious that we're standing between you all and a drink at the bar and seeing the exhibit, so...
Can we do one more?
I'll do one more to Alan to maybe give us some inspiration as we explore the exhibit. The question is, from an artistic perspective, what piece in the exhibition captures your attention?
I would say there are a lot of them that provide very different takes and possibility to perceive time in many different forms and ways. I would mention the work about fireflies somehow, this dialogue that is created between artificial lightning and the response, so that opens up something, and it's interesting and fascinating to see.
And Dr. Amichai is right up there. He's the one that did the firefly work, so he's here right now if you want to talk to him.
Fantastic. Before we close, just one final piece of advice from each of you for, just very briefly, for how to live more in tune with your circadian rhythms. Maybe Marilyne, would you like to start?
Don't underestimate the importance of light in your daily lives. Be outdoors, be sensitive to it, be respectful of how important it is for you to be exposed to enough light during the day, to be deprived from light during the night, and that this matters. It matters in the long run. It matters. It might not be evident instantaneously, but it does matter. So I think that would be the advice. And then it's about finding ways to be. It's easy. Anything more close to the conditions under which we evolved have a likely chance to be good for you.
Mm-hmm. Great, Alan, over to you.
Yeah, me rather than an advice, I would an invitation to leave room for hesitation and contemplation, for art, but also for a starry night in the countryside. And yeah, leave room to just slow down for a moment.
Slow down. Beth.
Well, I want to summarize both of them and say, go camping.
Yeah, that seems like the best thing, right?
Yeah, you can be outside and you can slow down.
I remember once camping on a beach in Mexico and completely losing, any sense of anything other than the cycle of night and day, and it was you felt so good after that. For about a week, you were completely adjusted. Wonderful. Well, there's so much more to discuss. There's a whole exhibition to experience. Tomorrow, if you're still hungry to dive into this topic in more detail, tomorrow we will have this wonderful symposium that Brenda mentioned right here from 10 o'clock till 4 o'clock. We have all sorts of chronobiologists, artists, scientists exploring the question of circadian rhythms and exploring this wonderful exhibition. We'll also have much more happening. We have a dream symposium happening in January, which should be really exciting, involving Adam Horowitz, and it's going to be over at the Media Lab, and but also happening here, and we'll be doing all sorts of experiments throughout the run of the show. Please enjoy it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating tonight. And Marilyne wants to say something.
Yes, I would love for the artists that have contributed to the exhibition and are present in this room to maybe come down on stage so that we can introduce you, and you can also engage with the audience.
This is a great chance for people to meet. Many of the artists are here tonight, and we're thrilled that many of them have traveled to be with us. So please come and join us on the stage, and then once they're down, I would love you to join me in thanking our panel and thanking, again, everybody who has created this wonderful exhibition. Or maybe they're coming down a bit slowly, so maybe we can... Don't be shy, come.